But for now, let's take a look at what Jesus has to say about judging in light of where he's just been teaching. He's been the section before this, he talked about not being anxious or worried. That's what we looked at last week. And all of us can relate to that in some manner. Different times, we go through different things. But now he's going to focus on how our relationships with one another can sometimes be filled with strife or conflict if we focus on judging others or thinking about somebody else's problem without thinking about where we're at. And really kind of coming to a place where we can be more gracious and be more civil and be more merciful. And this was really at the heart of Jesus' whole Sermon on the Mount, how we can become more like God. And that's what pure discipleship is. God wants us, first of all, us to know him. And we come to know him through Jesus. But God also wants us to be like him. Is God merciful? Yes. Is God gracious? Yes. Is God forgiving? Yes. But God is also righteous and calls us to live in a way that is right and good. But when we try to take the place of God, we begin to place ourselves in the seat of judgment. And you see this all around us in the world today. I mean, from the late night comedians to the different talk shows on the media, through Facebook and other things that people throw out there, and sometimes it seems like people are trying to play God. Like, we got all these tools and all this information, and we're omniscient. Are we all powerful? No! But we sometimes play that role. It just seems like this matter of judging has gotten out of hand. I think what Jesus was leading us to is not judgmentalism. Of course, he said, don't judge. And this goes back to the thing earlier in the Sermon about forgive others and live to forgive. If you don't forgive others, you won't be forgiven. Whoa. So this whole thing of being like God, gracious, merciful, but ultimately trusting that God knows how to sort it out and how God will work to bring his justice, his judgment in the fullness of time, whether it be in the time that we live or be it at the fullness and end of time. Ultimately trusting that God is God, and God is ultimately going to judge all people, and he will measure his mercy along with measuring the consequence of disobedience and the consequence that exists where people don't have faith and are alienated from God. So, ultimately, we have to trust. And I like that little thing. It says, don't judge people. You never know what kind of battle they are fighting. Sometimes you'll be going through your day and somebody will throw a bomb, whether it's a word bomb or a face bomb. You ever seen an expression, somebody looks at you and you go, whoa, hold on there. So whatever kind of bomb someone may set off in your midst, okay? I could go further, but I'm going to stop right there. But whatever kind of bomb it might be, you never know what kind of battle they are fighting. You never know. So be gracious. So Jesus says, do not judge, or you too will be judged. Well, all of us will be judged, but what is Jesus saying here? He's talking about we'll get into essentially that if you judge people in the way that you think you're God, then you will be placing yourself in a place of risk, and you will be assuming a role that will boomerang back to you. Okay? You ever notice that if you're mean, let's say you're too picky to a coworker, what's going to happen? They're going to come back at you, right? Unfortunately, it seems our behavior as human beings is like eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Once again, Jesus is saying, don't do that. Love your enemies. He said that earlier in the Sermon on the Mount. So do not judge, or you too will be judged. Things just have a way of being, boomeranging, like a domino effect. And how do you stop this vicious cycle? So judging is like a disease, and it's unhealthy to relationships. It's unhealthy. Mother Teresa said, if you judge people, you have no time to love them. I love that. If you judge people, you have no time to love them. So for in the same way you judge others, you will be judged, Jesus said. Judging creates ill will and creates conflict. Because all of a sudden we've placed, some sort of barrier or assumption in the midst of a relationship. So, this matter of judging and measuring is something that takes place. If you have a scale, you ever use those old scales, like the picture there? You ever use those old scales? And I remember chemistry lab, we had something like that, except for I think it was like you had weights on this side, and you had this little thing over here where you placed whatever compound it was. And then you'd try to put the little weights on the scale, and it would measure up, and then you'd find out how heavy it was. But what happens if our weights are inaccurate? What if it says one thing on the weight and it's really something different? How accurate are we in our weight and assessment? My guess is we're not near as accurate as that weighing scale in the chemistry lab. When it comes to weighing and understanding people, our knowledge is limited. Granted, we have, it seems like, plentiful knowledge and information in our day, and then we begin to assume we know it all because we've heard something beat into our heads this way and that way, and then we come to a conclusion. But the reality is we still have limited knowledge, and our measurement is flawed. And so when we begin to measure a situation, or we begin to judge others with our own measurement, it will be inherently flawed because we're not God. And it has a way of, once again, boomeranging and creating ill will and conflict. Judging, therefore, is often inaccurate, and it becomes condescending. We begin to think we know better than somebody else, and we begin to shut down the gate of information. And that's a problem. And we see that when people start saying, I'm in this camp, no, I'm in this camp, and begin not to hear each other and not to think objectively. It's so important in our day and time that we recognize that all of us have some inaccuracy. And all of us, if we're not careful, can think more highly of ourselves than we should, or look down upon other people who think differently from us, who look differently from us, who come from a different culture. Yeah, it's something that broke my heart in our community. I was just walking Teddy, and I noticed two families. A new family had moved in our neighborhood, and it's a beautiful Indian family with young children, and they were out to play in the snow, and they looked over, and their neighbor, their kids were out playing in the snow, and the Indian kids looked over like, can we join you? And they didn't respond. And then the Indian kids took the initiative. The parents are watching over here. The parents are watching over here. And so, but the Indian kids go ahead, and the parents say, go ahead over. And they go over, and then the kids in the other house are like looking at their parents. Is it okay? And the parents didn't give them go ahead. They just stood there like paralyzed and looked at the situation, instead of encouraging. Maybe there's something I missed, and maybe there's something else that happened later. I'm praying there was. But sometimes we form preconceptions, and we pass those on to our children. There's a lot of racism still in the world, and people have inaccurate assumptions this people who are different from them. And like, instead of encouraging their children to get to know their neighbors, sometimes this is, they're different from us. And they don't, and it's so important that we set the bar, we set the pace, that we are the ambassadors of reconciliation, the ambassadors of truth and love. That is what we are called to be. And in this community, you think that everything is just wonderful. Well, I'll tell you what, there's a lot of subtle things that go on. and we could do better. And we are charged with responsibility to show the world how to love one's neighbor. Amen?
Amen.
So, I have to be careful about this. But, I put that little thing up there about ethics. Isn't it crazy? Sometimes in the measure of things, we think ethics are not as important as something else, whatever it might put in that measure. So, Jesus then gets into a very interesting and practical application point. And I just love when Jesus does this kind of thing. Everyday things. Knock on wood. Well, we're getting into planks and specs. Of course, he's a carpenter. What else is a carpenter? He's going to use the tools and his experience to relate to people. We all know what a plank is, and we all know what a sliver or a speck is. Either one, if it hits you the wrong way, will hurt you. Well, okay, so Jesus talks about making corrections to yourself before correcting others. And he uses hyperbole. You know what hyperbole, exaggerating or using, just a contrast. He said, why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye, your sister's eye, and pay no attention to the plank in your own eye? It's just almost comical, the contrast here. And everyone, if I was there listening to Jesus, I might have a chuckle at first. I would say, wow, that's really something, Jesus. And then boom, it might hit me, the plank that's sitting in my eye. I might be like, oh Lord, you just got me. I thought I had just a little speck as I'm looking at somebody else. But in fact, I have a plank. So make corrections to yourself before correcting others. It's not that we shouldn't be critical or in a good way or help others out and give positive correction if it's necessary. It's just that so many times people will count other people's sins and assume that's what you're supposed to do without looking at oneself in the mirror. Someone said, counting other people's sins does not make you a saint. Unfortunately, there are those who seem to be preoccupied with that. And I saw this little cartoon I thought was interesting. It says, the guy on the left says, dude, I think I got something in my eye. Of course, the guy with the big plank, hey, don't worry, I'll help you get it out. Good luck. So, don't assume that you're above correction. In every situation, if there's some degree of conflict or some degree of misunderstanding or something that you need to clarify, don't assume that you're above correction. Don't assume you know everything. And don't assume that there's something that maybe you need to change. You might not see it. All of us actually need each other. Isn't that what Jesus is saying here? That we need each other? To help us each understand more about how, we work together or don't, and how we can improve. We all need each other. So how can you say to your brother, let me take that speck out of your eye, when all the time there's that big old plank in your eye? Like the Lego Bible, I don't know if you've ever seen it online, the Brick Testament, I think it's also called. You can find it online. You'll find all different Bible stories and parables. So here's the guy with the planks out of his eyes. Says, that's better. But hypocrite, it says, you hypocrite, Jesus said, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. So Jesus does affirm that there's ways that we're to help each other, but correct oneself and any false assumptions before helping. Now, let's get to this verse 6, which is probably one of the more interesting interjections of wisdom that Jesus puts into his Sermon on the Mount. People have speculated, what is the meaning of this? I've read a bunch of commentaries about this thing, about do not give to dogs, but is sacred, and so forth. And what's he talking about? And just as this verse seems to come out of nowhere, Jesus is saying that there is the existence of evil. He's not saying that dogs are bad. Dogs are wonderful companions, and all of nature has its place and everything. But the reality is there is a brokenness in our world. There's an evil that exists, and to ignore this evil and to be undiscerning can be dangerous. So Jesus says, be wise and do not give dogs what is sacred. In other words, be wise and alert, particularly as it comes to sharing the gospel and living out your faith. And you might remember there was a time that Jesus was casting out demons. And the demons spoke back to him. And they said, why are you interfering with us, Son of God? When you come here, have you come here to torture us? And they were blaspheming, and they were trying to discredit Jesus. And they were trying to divert people away from who Jesus was and his mission of mercy, his mission of love, his mission of forgiveness and salvation. Instead, they were trying to distort Jesus' message so people would think first of condemnation and not think of salvation. And this gets, of course, into this whole matter of the reality of evil. So while Jesus is talking about forgiveness and not judging, the reality is we must be discerning, because evil at times will manifest itself. And so, in this case, when he says, do not give dogs what is sacred, it takes you to the temple of Jerusalem. There they prepared meats, and this meat would be offered in a sacrifice to God. So he is making a connection to the offering and sacrifice that people will give to God. But the problem at that time was that many times their offering or sacrifice, their meat offering, was tainted. And the things that they were taught were tainted and not pure. And it is so important that we come to God with a pure heart. Not that we're perfect, but that we don't put on the impression that we are perfect. And see, this is how it connects to this passage. And so there was a problem among the Israelites at that time and the teachers who become involved with false teaching, what we call apostasy. It happens today too. False teachers. False teachers will want people to give them their money, give them their stuff, give them what is sacred, their heart, their focus, their devotion. These false teachers want to eat your meat, more or less. So this is where Jesus is getting into, do not give dogs what is sacred. Those who teach apostasy, those who are false shepherds, do not give them what's important, what is sacred. This takes discernment. And also then Jesus says, do not throw your pearls to the pigs. In a way, remember that thing that Jesus said about the man who was a collector of pearls? And he all of a sudden one day found the greatest, most beautiful pearl, and he gave all the pearls away so he could have that one pearl. Well, in a way, Jesus was saying that he is that pearl. And you should be willing to give everything just so you can know Jesus and follow him. Even to the rich young ruler, he said, give it all away. Come and follow me. And so it's so essential that we be careful not to forsake the value of faith. When we throw our pearls or our faith away, or we let other people interfere, it's like just saying, well, what was important is not important anymore. And even the Apostle Paul talks about to one of the churches where people had gone astray. He said, who cut in? Who got in the way? Who got in the middle of your race? Who took your pearls away? Who took your faith away? Go get it back again. Don't just give your faith away because somebody questions it. And young people, I want to tell you, not just young people, all of us here, we will have people who will come into our lives and try to steer us away from trusting the Lord. You will have people who will say, how can you believe that? Or why don't you believe this over here? And what will happen is they want you to join them in the place where there's no pearl. They want you to join them in a place where there's no God. In a way, to trust that in yourself. You hear a lot of self-help kind of thing, or mystical stuff that has no substance. A relationship of ambiguity. And once again, it's that apostasy and those false teachers who will want you to cast what's valuable away so you trust in them and their teaching, so they feel better about themselves. But Jesus is do not throw this away. Now, there is a false teaching that would say that the pigs are a certain type of people and the dogs are a certain type of people. Back in the day, maybe the Romans were the dogs and the pigs were the pagans and the Gentiles, and that is a false interpretation of this passage. Or people then even apply it in terms of racism, sadly enough, over time in history of the church. Be careful, that's false teaching. Jesus is talking about one's faith and relationship with God, and it has nothing to do with race or culture or people in terms of those differences. It has to do with the spiritual battles that we will face. So if you do, they may trample them under their feet. So be advised that people of ill intent will put you down. Okay? If somebody comes at you and they put you down, recognize they have their own battle. Something's going on. Don't judge them, but love them. But you don't have to yield to their intentions. You don't have to let them trample you over. Don't let them lead you astray. I remember one time when I was in high school, I had a friend, a new guy who had come in town, and he was kind of a troubled guy. But he was kind of charismatic, and there were a few people who started to hang out with him. And he was in my art class, sitting at my table. So I got to know him a little bit. And he invited me wanted to go out on a Friday night, and my mom said, "Be careful." I said, "Okay." She didn't know much about him, but she just warned me, "Be careful." And so I went out, and after a while I realized, wow, this guy has a whole different value set. What he considers important, and his lack of a relationship with God. Because I was already a believer in Christ in high school. I had given my life to the Lord. I was a junior in high school. My life had changed. But here's this guy who's just totally into all sorts of crazy stuff. And I said to him, I said, "Pat," I said, "do you know the Lord?" And I tried to witness to him. A couple times I tried to witness to him. Finally, my mom asked more about him, and I told her what I was trying to witness to him. She said, "You know, there comes a time you can try, and you can go only so far. But if you find that you may put yourself in a place where it's compromising or maybe dangerous, you may need to step back a little bit and have wisdom and have discernment. You have to be careful." And then she quoted this thing about Jesus and the dogs and the pigs. So I said, "Okay, Mom." At the time I thought, boy, she's being hard. And I came to realize her wisdom and appreciate it over time. So be advised that people without faith can become ruthless. They can turn and tear you to pieces. So the call of God, our Heavenly Father, is to believe in Jesus Christ and follow His lead in discernment that involves self-reflection and avoidance of making false assumptions about ourselves or others. And by overcoming the human sin and tendency of judgmentalism, we may discern the truth and working of God's grace in more healthy relationships with others and set better boundaries for ourselves. Jesus also taught that purity of discipleship will warrant vigilance and care in sharing the gospel in a world where evil responses are real. Let's pray.